Welcome back to the deep dive. Have you ever looked around your workplace and realized it feels less like a predictable, well-oiled machine and a lot more like a chaotic living organism?
It's a very familiar feeling, yeah.
Right. If that thought has ever crossed your mind, you are actually tapping into a major shift in how we understand professional life.
Absolutely.
Today, we are exploring two um, revolutionary schools of thought that emerged in the second half of the 20th century.
And these really changed everything.
They did. We're talking about the systems approach and the cultural approach. We are pulling insights primarily from Chapter 4 of Catherine Miller's work on organizational communication, along with some really great perspectives from an article by Wayne Loke called Can You Design a New Team Culture?
It really is it's a massive conceptual leap. To appreciate why these two approaches were so groundbreaking, we have to recognize the older models they replace.
Right, the older stuff.
Exactly. Early 20th century thinking was completely dominated by the classical approach, and that viewed the organization literally as a machine.
Like actual cogs and gears.
Literally. It was all about standardizing parts, strict hierarchies, and finding one single best way to work. And then came the human relations approach.
Which was a bit softer. I mean, they used a family metaphor.
They did. It focused heavily on keeping workers happy. It operated on this basic assumption that a happy worker is inherently a productive worker.
But both of those older models they were highly prescriptive, right?
Yes.
They existed just to dictate exactly how an organization ought to be run from the top down. But the two approaches we are unpacking today, they're descriptive.
Which is a crucial distinction.
Yeah, they don't hand you a recipe book for management. They give you a lens to understand how organizations actually operate in the messy real world.
Precisely. And while they are descriptive, understanding them provides us with incredible practical shortcuts. Because when you stop trying to force your workplace to act like a predictable machine and start understanding the actual laws governing its behavior, you can navigate your own career much more effectively.
Because organizations adapt. They mutate.
They do. They are constantly interacting with everything around them.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with that first major metaphor. The organization as a biological system.
The origin of this is actually fascinating, because systems theory didn't even start in business management.
It didn't.
No, it started in the 1960s with a theoretical biologist named Ludwig von Bertalanffy.
A biologist.
Right. He was studying living systems in the natural sciences and realized his concepts applied perfectly to the social sciences.
Oh, wow.
He recognized that an organization is a living, breathing entity that absolutely must interact with its environment to survive. It operates as an open system.
That actually makes intuitive sense when you look at the anatomy of this biological system.
It really does.
Because there are three main components. The first is hierarchical ordering. And we aren't just talking about a simple org chart here.
No, definitely not.
In systems theory, hierarchical ordering means a system is made up of nested subsystems, and it's embedded within larger supersystems.
Like Russian nesting dolls.
Exactly like that. You have your individual team, which is a subsystem of your division, which sits inside the organizational system, which is nested within the supersystem of the global market.
And none of those systems operate independently. Which brings us to the second component, interdependence.
Right.
No part of the system can function without the others. If a software development team pushes a new update, they rely entirely on the marketing subsystem to explain it to users.
And marketing relies on customer support to handle the inevitable bug reports.
Precisely.
Which perfectly explains why a bottleneck in one department instantly gives another department a massive headache.
They are intimately connected.
And that leads to the third component, permeability. A system must have open boundaries.
It has to.
Information, resources, capital, it all has to flow in and out. If a company becomes impermeable, if leadership stops taking in new information from the outside world or ignores market trends, the system eventually suffocates.
And to prevent that suffocation, the system needs a pulse. It needs processes to stay alive. Systems theory describes this as an input-throughput-output process.
Input, throughput, output.
Exactly. The organization takes in raw materials or data. That's the input. It transforms those inputs through the daily friction and effort of its employees, the throughput.
The actual work.
Right. And then it pushes a product or service back out, the output. But the crucial mechanism that regulates this entire metabolism is feedback.
And feedback comes in two very different forms here. First, you have deviation-reducing feedback.
The corrective kind.
Right? It's purely corrective. It keeps the organization running steady on its current baseline. I actually once had a manager who was incredibly pedantic about how our weekly reports were formatted.
Oh, we've all had one of those.
If a font was wrong, he sent it back. He didn't care about the actual sales numbers as much as he cared about reducing deviation from his formatting standard. It just maintained the status quo.
And that kind of feedback is necessary for basic stability. But the second type is what actually guarantees long-term survival. Deviation amplifying feedback.
Amplifying.
Yes. This is information that forces the system to grow, change, and adapt to a new environment.
So it's positive disruption.
Exactly. If a regional manager notices a sudden massive shift in what consumers are buying, deviation amplifying feedback means taking that anomaly and using it to completely overhaul the product line.
It fundamentally changes the system.
It does.
What stands out to you? Think about your own team for a second. Are you just putting out fires and maintaining the status quo, or are you actively amplifying the right signals to help your team adapt?
It is a vital question. And when these components and feedback loops are all interacting, we start to witness some incredible phenomena. We call these emergent properties.
This is the part that feels like magic to me. Because of all this interdependence, you get something called holism. The idea is that the whole is genuinely greater than the sum of its parts.
Right.
You put 5 brilliant people in a room, and they don't just add their ideas together, they multiply them. They bounce concepts off each other and generate solutions no individual could have reached alone.
That is the ideal scenario, yes.
Oh, hold on. Let me challenge that for a second. Does holism always work out that beautifully in practice?
Not at all.
What about groupthink? Because sometimes you put 5 brilliant people in a room and you just end up with 3 hours of pointless debate and a compromise solution that nobody actually likes.
That is a very fair pushback. Holism isn't inherently positive. It simply means the outcome is distinct from the individual inputs. Sometimes that emergent property is a stroke of genius, and sometimes
It's a disastrous echo chamber.
exactly, the system amplifies whatever dynamics are present, which is why the next emergent property, equifinality, is so important.
Equifinality is the concept that often drives traditional managers up the wall.
Oh, absolutely.
It states that a system can reach the exact same final goal from completely different initial conditions and by a variety of different paths. Because the environment is complex, the whole idea of one best way to do things is a myth.
Consider the software company 37 Signals. They're the team behind the book rework.
Great example.
They built a massively successful enterprise by actively ignoring the standard rules of business. They ditched traditional strategic planning, they eliminated almost all staff meetings, and they ignored typical growth metrics.
They just threw out the playbook.
They took a completely non-traditional path, but because of equifinality, they still achieved immense market success.
And that perfectly illustrates the final emergent property, requisite variety. This principle states that the internal complexity of a system must match the external complexity of its environment.
The internal has to match the external.
Right, think of it like trying to play a highly complex modern video game using a classic Atari joystick that only have one button.
You wouldn't get very far.
You wouldn't. The controller lacks the requisite variety to navigate the environment of the game. If your business faces a fast-moving, multifaceted market, a rigid, top-down management structure will fail. Your internal team must be as adaptable as the problems they are solving.
Which brings us to a crucial question. How do humans actually process all this internal and external complexity?
It's a lot to take in.
It is. And this introduces the work of Carl Weick and his theory of organizing. Weick argues that organizations don't just exist in a physical space, they exist in an information environment.
Okay.
And we don't just passively observe that environment, we actively create it through a process he calls enactment.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Enactment completely flips how we view office politics and miscommunications.
It really does.
The environment isn't just out there waiting for us to discover it. Week says different people will look at the exact same piece of information and imbue it with totally different meanings based on their past experiences.
Exactly. Imagine a senior executive lets out a heavy sigh during a pitch.
Okay, I'm picturing it.
One employee enacts that sigh as a sign of exhaustion from a long flight, but another employee enacts it as a sign that the project is doomed and starts polishing their resume.
Two totally different realities.
From the exact same data point.
The core challenge in Week's theory is dealing with this equivocality, the inherent unpredictability or ambiguity of information.
Right.
If you get a Slack message from your boss on a Friday afternoon that just says, "See me now," That is a highly equivocal message.
Purifying, really.
Exactly. It could mean you were getting promoted, you're getting fired, or someone just left a cake in the break room. Our main job as organizational members is to make sense of that chaos and reduce the equivocality.
And Week Notes, we use two primary tools to make sense of things: assembly rules and communication cycles.
Okay, break those down.
Assembly rules are your standard operating procedures. If equivocality is low and the problem is familiar, like a client asking for a standard billing invoice, you just use an assembly rule to process it efficiently.
But when things are highly ambiguous, standard rules completely fail.
They fall apart.
That is when we have to rely on communication cycles. This is intense back and forth dialogue where people introduce ideas, react to each other, and slowly construct a shared meaning.
There's a great real-world example of a hospital going through a massive restructuring.
Well, from the reading, right?
Yes. They gave a group of nurses a brand new title, care coordinator. But management offered zero guidance on what the role actually entailed.
So the equivocality was off the charts.
Absolutely. Some nurses tried to rely on assembly rules. They simply assumed the new title meant the exact same thing as their old job.
They didn't adapt.
They didn't. But the most effective nurses engaged in heavy communication cycles. They talked constantly with doctors, administration, and each other. They actively debated and crafted the boundaries of their new roles.
They used interaction to literally build their new professional reality.
Exactly.
It proves that communication isn't just a vehicle for exchanging facts. It is the raw material we use to build our world at work.
Beautifully put.
Which naturally transitions us to our second major framework. Systems theory explains the mechanics and the biology of the workplace. But it kind of leaves out the soul or the personality of the organization.
The human element.
Right. To understand that, we have to put away our biology microscopes and become workplace anthropologists. Let's talk about the cultural metaphor.
The concept of corporate culture practically took over the business world in the early 1980s.
It was everywhere.
You had these massive bestsellers like Deal and Kennedy's Corporate Cultures and Peters and Waterman's In Search of Excellence.
Call classic business airport books.
Exactly. They studied high-performing companies and argued that success came down to having a strong culture, characterized by clear values, heroic figures who embodied those values, and established rituals.
But the academic world pushed back hard against this, didn't they?
They did. What's fascinating here is why they pushed back. Scholars criticized these books for treating culture as a commodity, a thing an organization has, much like a company has a fleet of delivery trucks.
Right, like an asset you can just buy.
They called this value engineering. It assumed there was a single magic formula for success that a CEO could just dictate from the top down. But you cannot simply mandate a culture into existence.
Which ties directly into Wayne Loke's article, Can You Design a New Team Culture? Loke explores this exact tension. Managers constantly want to design a culture to engineer a specific vibe.
They try to force it.
But the modern descriptive approach argues that culture isn't a poster on the wall. Culture is something an organization is. It is a complex, fragile reality created and maintained by the way people interact every single day.
To map out just how complex this is, researchers rely on Edgar Schein's model of culture. Schein visualizes organizational culture like an onion with 3 distinct layers.
Okay, an onion.
The outermost layer is made up of artifacts and behaviors. These are the tangible things you can see, hear, and feel. It is the open plan office, the casual dress code, the tone of the emails, or the company retreats.
But those artifacts don't mean much on their own. You have to peel back to the middle layer, which is the stated values of the group, what people claim they care about.
What's written on the website.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, Schein argues, you have to go to the absolute core of the onion to find the truth. The core consists of basic assumptions.
The deepest layer.
These are the deeply held, unwritten, almost subconscious beliefs that subtly drive every single decision in the organization.
Let's look at Google as a primary example of this onion model. Google is famous for its bizarre outer layer artifacts.
They really are.
They once swapped out their homepage logo for Topeka, Kansas. They have literally rented herds of live sheep to mow the lawns at their corporate headquarters.
Which is wild. And if you just look at those artifacts, it seems like arbitrary quirkiness.
Just being weird for the sake of it.
Right. But those behaviors stem from a very specific core assumption. Google has historically operated on a double bottom line.
Meaning profit isn't the only metric.
Exactly. The deeply held belief isn't just about maximizing shareholder profit. It's an assumption that the company should have a net positive impact on humanity and prioritize unconventional innovation.
And once you understand that core assumption, their major business decisions make total sense. It explains why they were historically willing to pull search operations out of the Chinese market to protest censorship.
Abandoning billions in potential revenue.
Exactly. The core assumption dictated the behavior.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we can also see the dark side of this model. Core assumptions can lead to catastrophic tragedies, as we saw with the NASA space shuttle disasters.
The investigations into both the Challenger and Columbia explosions are chilling studies of organizational culture.
Truly sobering.
The public assumption was always that NASA prioritized safety above all else. But investigators found that the true underlying core assumptions at the time were very different. A prevailing assumption was that adhering to strict launch schedules and avoiding budget overruns took precedence over almost everything.
Another deeply held assumption was that failure is not an option. On the surface, that sounds like a great motivational poster.
It sounds inspiring.
But in practice, it created an environment where the inherent extreme risks of spaceflight were culturally downplayed. If failure isn't an option, then nobody wants to be the one to raise their hand and say, I think we have a failing component.
Which led to what sociologists call the normalization of deviance. When engineers raised alarms about the O-rings functioning poorly in cold weather before the Challenger launch, their warnings conflicted with the core assumption that the schedule must be maintained.
So the culture literally silenced them.
It did. The organization processed the anomaly not as a critical threat, but as an acceptable risk. The culture blinded them to fatal flaws.
It really is a sobering realization that culture is not about employee happiness or ping pong tables. It is fundamentally about how a collective group processes reality and assesses risk.
That is the core of it.
And because it is built by humans, it is an ongoing improvisational performance. Every joke told in a meeting, every time a manager ignores a safety protocol, the culture is being actively rewritten.
And we have to abandon the illusion that there is a single, unified corporate culture in any large organization.
It's just not realistic.
Culture is emergent, and it is highly fragmented. You will have multiple subcultures operating simultaneously. The engineering department has an entirely different culture than the marketing department.
Sometimes those subcultures harmonize.
And sometimes they clash violently over resources and priorities.
Add in the fast-paced nature of the modern market mergers, leadership changes, new technologies, and culture is in a constant state of ambiguous flux.
Always changing.
So what does this all mean? When we step back and synthesize both the systems and cultural approaches, the ultimate takeaway is that we have to retire the machine metaphor.
Put it in the past.
You are not a cog executing a predetermined script. Your workplace is a living ecosystem and a complex, improvised culture. When you internalize that, your professional strategy changes.
You start navigating instead of just operating.
Exactly. You stop waiting for top-down directives and start actively seeking out deviation-amplifying feedback. You learn to anticipate ambiguity and utilize communication cycles to build shared meaning. And most importantly, you realize that your daily interactions aren't just taking place within the culture, they are actively constructing it.
This raises an important question for you to consider, especially as our work environments evolve. With the rapid rise of remote work and artificial intelligence, what happens to an organization's biological system when half of the organs executing throughput are algorithms?
That is a wild thought.
And what happens when the culture exists entirely within the text of a Slack channel? How does a company maintain its cultural soul and shared core assumptions when there is no physical office space to house its artifacts?
That is a phenomenal puzzle to leave you with. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the hidden architecture of our work lives. Keep looking beneath the surface, question the assumptions around you, and we will catch you next time.